On nights like these, the world feels gentler than it really is. The houses along the street are quiet, their windows dim and soft with the glow of bedside lamps, and the air outside settles into that cool stillness that only arrives after midnight. It's the hour when most of the noise has drained out of the world, leaving only the hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves brushing against a fence. There's a strange comfort in that calm, a sense that everything is tucked safely into place, and nothing unusual could possibly slip through the edges. But in those quiet hours, when the night feels thinner and the dark stretches just a little farther than it should, people start noticing things they would have missed in the daylight. A shape where no shape should be, a movement in a place that should have been still, an outline that appears only when your eyes are tired enough to second-guess themselves. Sometimes it's a flicker in the corner of your vision, sometimes a shadow standing where you know no one was a moment ago, and sometimes it's just the unsettling feeling that something is watching from just beyond the light. And if you stay awake long enough, if you listen to the quiet closely enough, you might realize the night isn't as empty as it seems. These stories come from people who saw things that shouldn't exist, things that stepped out of the ordinary world for just a moment, long enough to be noticed, long enough to be remembered. Whether you believe them or not, their voices linger in the dark, waiting to be heard. I used to spend a lot of time at a winter cabin my uncle owned, a quiet place tucked between tall pines and an old frozen lake that didn't see much activity after November. The cabin wasn't big, just one bedroom, a creaky front porch, and a wood stove that took forever to warm the space, but I loved how isolated it felt. The nights were usually silent except for the occasional groan of ice shifting beneath the lake or the soft scrape of branches against the roof. I'd sit by the window with a mug of something warm, watching the last thin line of daylight fade behind the tree line while the snow reflected what little light remained. It always felt like the world had slowed down out there, leaving room for a kind of peace I never got in the city. The first time I noticed the shape, it was barely more than a smudge against a backdrop of white. I had stepped outside to grab another load of firewood, the air cold enough that each breath rose in small, sharp clouds. The moon hung low, giving the frozen lake a dull silver sheen. That was when I saw it, something standing far out near the center, tall and dark, like a person bundled in winter clothing. I remember squinting, trying to make out details, but a haze of snow drifted across the ice and blocked my view. When the air cleared a moment later, the shape was gone. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a tree shadow or a trick of the moonlight on uneven ice. But the next night it was there again. This time I saw it more clearly, standing upright, perfectly still. It was too far away for me to see any details, but its outline didn't match anything natural. It wasn't a stump or a bush buried under snow, it was the shape of a person. I felt a small shiver work its way along my arms, though the air was warm inside the cabin. I waited for movement, a shift in weight, a tilt of the head, anything that would reassure me it was just someone ice fishing or passing through, but it didn't move. Not even slightly. When I blinked, it was gone again, as if the moment my eyes left it, it slipped beneath the surface of the night. Over the next few evenings, I found myself glancing at the lake more often. It became a habit, something I did without thinking whenever the cabin grew too quiet or the shadows inside stretched a little too long. Sometimes the lake was empty, smooth, and untouched, but other nights the shape returned. Always in a slightly different spot, always the same silent posture. I tried telling myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, an illusion created by the wind smoothing patches of ice differently. But each time I saw it, a slow unease settled in my chest. The kind that didn't spike suddenly, but grew steadily, quietly, like cold creeping under a door. One night after a long day of chopping wood and trying to keep my mind off it, I stepped outside with my jacket only half zipped. The cold bit through the fabric instantly. The lake was unusually still, no snow falling, just a pale stretch of frozen water under a sky that looked heavier than usual. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the shape again. Only this time something felt different. The outline was sharper, almost as if it was closer, maybe halfway between the center of the lake and the shoreline. A distance no one should have been standing at, especially since the ice that close wasn't always stable. I felt my breath falter. Something inside me knew I should go back inside, shut the door, and let the night swallow the lake the way it always did. But instead, I stayed there, gripping the firewood a little too tightly, waiting for the shape to do something. It didn't, but the reflection beneath it did. The ice was still unbroken, smooth enough to reflect the sky faintly. But below the dark outline, the reflection looked wrong. It lagged slightly behind, as if a fraction of a second out of sync. When the wind brushed across the lake, the reflection shuddered while the figure remained perfectly still. The realization made me step back without meaning to. My breath fogged in front of me, trembling a little. I told myself I didn't see it right, that my eyes were tired, that the cold was distorting everything. But the reflection shifted again. A faint ripple of motion traveling through it like something breathing underneath. I slammed the cabin door shut and locked it, even though locking a door meant nothing against whatever that was. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound, the stove settling, the wind touching the walls, the faint noise of ice groaning under the weight of winter, felt like something moving closer. I kept telling myself I'd go home in the morning, cut the trip short, and make some excuse about the weather. But morning came with a soft snowfall and the world looked harmless again, almost inviting. I convinced myself it had been nothing but a trick of shadows on ice. The final night was what pushed me over the edge. It was nearly midnight. I had been reading, trying to stay awake because I feared what waiting in the dark felt like. I made the mistake of glancing out the window one more time. And that was when I saw it, the shape standing not near the center of the lake, not halfway across, but right at the shoreline. Right where the ice met the snowy earth. A dark silhouette so still it almost seemed carved from the night itself. My breath caught in my throat. The reflection beneath it pulsed faintly, as though something beneath the surface was pushing upward, pressing against the frozen barrier. The longer I stared, the colder I felt. It was the kind of cold that didn't just touch skin, it seeped into bone. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly. I had the overwhelming sense that if I looked away, even for a blink, the shape would be closer. So I forced myself backward until my legs hit the edge of the couch. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, loud enough that it drowned out the ticking of the stove. I stayed there staring at the window, waiting to see if it would move, if it would come any closer. It didn't, but the reflection beneath it grew darker, like something was rising up to meet it. I left the cabin before sunrise, not even bothering to clean up or put the firewood away. I drove with shaking hands all the way back to town, not looking once in the rearview mirror, terrified I'd see something standing in the road behind me. I didn't return to the cabin after that. My uncle eventually sold it, saying the winters were too harsh to justify keeping it. I didn't tell him why I really left or why I still can't look at frozen lakes for more than a moment. Even now, when winter comes and ice forms across the surface of ponds and lakes, I feel that same unease settle in my stomach. Because sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I swear I see a dark shape standing motionless in the distance. Not close, not threatening, just watching. And every time it appears, I remember the reflection shifting beneath it, lagging behind, shuddering, rising. as if something beneath the ice is still trying to surface. I've lived on the same quiet suburban street for most of my adult life. The kind of street where nothing dramatic ever happens and everyone knows at least one detail about everyone else's daily routine. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Harlan, was one of those people you could set your clock by. Every morning before the sun had fully risen, he'd be out watering the hedges that lined his front lawn. Every afternoon, he'd sit on his porch with a newspaper folded neatly in half, and every evening his living room lamp would turn on at the exact same time. He was polite, soft-spoken, and always wore the same knitted cardigan no matter the weather. Seeing him moving around his house was something I never thought much about. He was simply part of the landscape of my everyday life. It wasn't until the first winter after I moved in that things started feeling off. One night, around 11, I went into my kitchen to get a glass of water. The window above my sink faced directly toward the side of his house. His upstairs bedroom window was lit, but dimly like a lamp had been left on with the shade turned sideways. As I filled my glass, I noticed a figure standing there, a silhouette framed against the curtains. The shape looked like him, thin shoulders, slightly stooped posture. He stood perfectly still, facing out toward the street. I didn't think much of it. Maybe he couldn't sleep. Maybe he was looking at something outside. But when I checked again before turning off the kitchen light, he was still standing there unchanged. The next morning, I saw him outside watering his plants like he always did, and I almost forgot the image entirely. But that night, when I went to wash a plate before bed, he was there again, still in that window, still motionless, still angled toward the street as if observing something I couldn't see. I remember leaning closer to the glass, trying to make out any detail of his face or clothing, but the lighting kept his features hidden. For a second, I wondered if he'd fallen asleep standing up, but after another minute, he shifted slightly. Not a natural shift, no change in posture or tilt of the head, just a faint flicker in the silhouette like a shadow twitching against the curtain. I assumed it was just the lamp inside flickering. I rinsed the plate, dried my hands, and walked away. The following evening, the figure was there again. By the fourth night, it had become something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just that he appeared in the window every night now, it was that he never moved in a way that made sense. Each night, I'd catch him standing there at different times between 10 and midnight in the exact same spot, the exact same pose as if frozen. I started watching more closely. Sometimes I'd see him blink or what looked like a blink, a momentary shift in the darkness around his face. Sometimes the light behind him would dim or brighten by the smallest amount, but he never walked away, never sat, never turned, just watched. One morning I saw his mailbox overflowing, something that never happened. He was meticulous about retrieving his mail. Later that day, I saw a delivery package sitting untouched on his porch long after the delivery guy drove off. The package was still there at sunset. When I saw him in the window again that night, a peculiar discomfort settled into my chest. If he was standing there every night, why wasn't he coming outside during the day? Why hadn't he picked up his mail? I remember standing at my sink longer than usual, staring into that window, watching the faint shadow of him remain unnervingly still. By the end of the week, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I finally walked over during the afternoon to check on him. His house was dark, not a single light on. His porch light, which usually flicked on at dusk, stayed off. I rang the bell once, then twice, no answer. I listened closely at the door but heard nothing. Eventually, I walked back home, telling myself maybe he had gone on a short trip and forgotten to set his lights. But that night, when I went into my kitchen, the upstairs bedroom window was glowing softly again, and the silhouette was standing there as always. My breath stopped for half a second. The curtains behind him weren't moving even though wind was blowing lightly outside. The room behind him seemed too still, too quiet, too dim in a way that reminded me of an empty house. The reflection on the window confused my sense of depth for a moment, and I found myself stepping closer to my own kitchen window, my fingertips pressing lightly against the cold glass. And then, without warning, the silhouette turned its head slightly, not toward the street, but toward me. I froze, the shape didn't move again, but that slight tilt had been unmistakable. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't random shadow play. Whatever was in that window had turned to look directly where I was standing. My heartbeat picked up in a slow, heavy thud that echoed in my ears, and I backed away from the glass so quietly it felt like I was trying not to disturb something. I barely slept that night. In the morning, a car was parked in his driveway, one I hadn't seen before. A pair of people, maybe in their 30s, were carrying boxes inside. I hesitated before walking over. The woman smiled politely when she saw me and introduced herself as his daughter. She explained almost casually that her father had been staying with her family for the past 2 weeks because of a medical procedure. My stomach dropped. I asked when he left. She told me 2 weeks ago. Right around the same time I first saw the figure. So I wanted to ask if anyone else had been in the house, if a caretaker had come by, if anyone lived there temporarily. But her answers came too easily. No one had been staying there. The house had been locked. She said they had only just arrived today to air the place out and clean a bit. That night, I couldn't bring myself to look out my kitchen window. Every time I walked into the room, I felt a cold pressure settle between my shoulder blades like someone was watching from outside. For days afterward, I avoided the window entirely. Sometimes, when the house was particularly quiet, I thought I heard a faint rustle from across the yard, almost like curtains being drawn. But I never checked. Even now, months later, I sometimes catch a reflection in my periphery when I pass that window, a dark, tall shape in a second-floor frame that shouldn't show anything at all. I always tell myself it's just memory lingering where fear once lived, but some nights, when the wind dies down and the neighborhood fades into silence, I swear I feel someone watching again. Not from my house, or from his. I used to take long drives at night when I needed space to think. There was something calming about empty highways after midnight, the way the world shrank down to just the hum of the engine, the faint rattle of loose change in the cup holder, and the soft static of whatever radio station managed to reach that far out. I liked the quiet. It felt honest, like the dark wasn't hiding anything, just stretching out behind me while I moved through it. I had driven those back roads for years and knew every curve, every cracked reflector, every lonely gas station that stayed open too late. So when a construction detour forced me onto a road I'd never taken before, I didn't think much of it at first. Roads branch everywhere out there. You eventually connect back to something familiar. The detour signs led me down a narrow lane bordered by tall, crowded trees. The further I drove, the more the branches knitted overhead until the sky disappeared completely. My headlights stretched only a short distance ahead, leaving the rest of the road swallowed in a thick, velvety darkness. The air felt colder there, not winter cold, but the kind that sinks beneath your clothes and makes your fingers tighten on the steering wheel. I kept expecting the detour to reconnect with the main road, but the lane just continued on, winding deeper into the trees. My GPS lost signal. The radio slipped into static. Even my phone light flickered when I checked the map, like it was struggling to keep up with something I couldn't see. After about 15 minutes of driving through what felt like the same stretch of road, the headlights washed over a concrete archway ahead. A tunnel, I slowed, surprised. I had lived in the area all my life and never heard of a tunnel anywhere near here. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't on any of the local hiking or driving routes I'd ever seen. The structure was old, older than the road leading to it, with moss creeping along its sides and water dripping in slow, rhythmic taps from the top. I stopped a few yards before entering, letting the car idle while I leaned forward in my seat. Something about the tunnel felt wrong. Not dangerous, not threatening, just wrong in a way that made my stomach tighten without explanation. I told myself to turn around. The detour wasn't worth the unease building in my chest. But when I put the car in reverse, the lane behind me looked darker than it should have been, so dark it felt like the trees had closed in around the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that backing up would lead me somewhere different than where I'd come from. So I inched forward instead, letting the car nose into the tunnel. The sound changed immediately. The engine's hum echoed strangely, stretching out a second longer than it should have. The tunnel lights dim, old bulbs mounted high up flickered weakly, casting pale halos that barely touched the walls. The moment I passed under the arch, a faint whisper drifted through the static of the radio. Not words, more like breath brushing against the speakers. I tried adjusting the station, but it didn't matter. Every channel held the same low, whispering sound, like someone standing too close to a microphone in an empty room. I kept driving, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But a few seconds later, when I checked the rearview mirror, my chest tightened. There were people, faint outlines of people, walking along the walls behind me. Their figures were blurry, too blurry to distinguish, but I could see them moving. Slow steps, no sound, no expression, just silhouettes drifting along the edges of the tunnel. Panic clawed at my throat. I turned around quickly, looking through the back window. Oh, nothing. The tunnel behind me was completely empty. When I looked at the mirror again, the figures were still there, keeping pace with my car even though the road behind me showed only darkness. My breath came out shallow and shaky. I tried to focus on the front windshield instead, but the tunnel stretched longer than it should have. I'd been inside for minutes now. No tunnel in this area should have been this long. The lights cast repeating patterns along the walls, but the repetition started feeling unnatural. The same stain, the same crack, the same rusted pipe appearing again and again as though the tunnel wasn't extending but looping. A sharp metallic ringing suddenly pinged through the speakers, making me jump. It lasted for only a second before dissolving back into static. When it faded, the whispers shifted, now layered, overlapping like multiple voices breathing in and out in a rhythm that didn't match mine. I swallowed, hard hands clammy on the steering wheel. I tried speeding up. The tunnel didn't end. I tried slowing down. The whispers got louder, rising just enough to feel like something was trying to form words. When I finally saw a faint light ahead, relief washed through me so strongly I almost laughed. The tunnel exit. I accelerated, eager to leave the suffocating darkness behind. I burst out into the open air with a sense of release, but the road outside wasn't the road I expected. It was the exact same spot I had entered from. Well, the tunnel spat me back out at the beginning. As I slammed the brakes, breathing hard, the archway behind me looked identical, same moss, same dripping water, same stale air rolling out of it. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the entire drive-through, but my odometer showed the miles I had traveled. My fuel gauge had dipped. Time had passed. Yet I was back where I started. I didn't want to go back in. Every part of me screamed not to. So I turned off the engine, sat there breathing heavily, and watched the tunnel in my rearview mirror. Oh, there were silhouettes standing inside it. Not moving now, just standing, facing me. I shut my eyes and reopened them. They were still there. The real tunnel behind me was empty, but the mirror showed them clearly. Shapes of people standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark, as if waiting for me to return. The nearest silhouette was only a few feet from the exit. Well, that was enough. I didn't care if the lane behind me had collapsed into pure darkness. I drove back the way I'd come, not looking into the mirror again until I reached a familiar intersection. When I got home, my hands shook so badly I struggled to unlock the door. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I drifted, I saw the tunnel lights flicker behind my eyelids. The next day, I checked every map I could find, digital, printed old county records. Nothing showed a tunnel in that area. When I returned a week later during daylight, the lane was still there, but the tunnel was. The trees were unbroken, growing naturally where the concrete archway should have stood. No signs of construction, no signs of disturbance, as if the road had never been altered at all. But sometimes, even now, when I drive past that region at night, my rearview mirror flickers for a second. Just long enough to reflect dim tunnel lights behind me. Just long enough to see silhouettes standing inside, waiting for a car that shouldn't have found them. I used to work the late shift in the archives department of our local university, a small windowless room tucked deep in the basement of the humanities building. Most people avoided the place after sunset because the hallways downstairs echoed strangely, and the old pipes rattled in ways that didn't match the heating schedule. But I didn't mind it. I actually preferred the quiet, the way sound softened around the cardboard file boxes, and how the hum of the old ventilation system became a steady background lull. My job was simple: organize old lecture reels and digitize them using an antique film projector the university refused to replace. It was clunky, loud, and unpredictable, but the warm light it cast across the room always made the late hours feel almost comforting. The first time I noticed something strange, it was so small I almost dismissed it entirely. I was threading a new film reel through the projector, the room dim except for the yellow glow of the machine and the faint buzz from the fluorescent bulbs overhead. When I switched the projector on, the film cast a large rectangle of flickering light against the wall. Dust floated lazily through the beam, and the shadows of the metal reels wavered across the floor. But as I glanced up to check the focus, I saw a shape standing in the frame, a tall, thin shadow that didn't belong to anything in the room. My body jolted for a moment, like my brain hit a pause button on everything else. I turned around quickly, scanning the room. Oh, there was no one there. I shrugged it off, assuming maybe the reels or a stack of boxes had cast the shape oddly. I repositioned the projector slightly and the shadow disappeared. Those machines could be finicky with light angles, especially with dust moving around. I told myself it was nothing unusual. I returned to my notes. But that little flicker of unease lingered in my chest longer than I expected, a faint pressure that didn't match the otherwise quiet atmosphere of the basement. A few nights later, I noticed the shadow again. This time it appeared while the projector was off. The machine was cooling down, clicking softly as the metal contracted, and the wall should have been blank except for a dim square from a hallway light leaking through the cracked door. Yet there it was, a dark silhouette at the back of the room, tall and rigid, as though someone was standing exactly in the center of where the projector beam usually landed. I blinked and looked again, and the shape faded slowly, as though receding rather than vanishing. Something about the way it dissolved made my skin tighten along my arms. I began paying closer attention after that. Each evening, as I loaded reels and switched between files, I found myself glancing at the wall more often. Shadow shapes would flicker in the periphery of the light, sometimes small, like a person bending down, sometimes tall and sharp, like a figure leaning forward. Every time I turned fully toward the wall, the shapes would disappear or melt back into the natural shadows. I checked the projector alignment, tested the bulbs, even rearranged the boxes around the room to see if they were creating the distortions. None of it made a difference. One night after the last student had left the building, the archives felt even quieter than usual. The kind of quiet where every click, every shift in the pipes, every breath seems louder than it should be. I was alone, threading a reel from the 1960s into the projector. Dust clung to my sleeves from hours of lifting old film canisters. The projector hummed on, casting its familiar glow. But when the light filled the wall, the shadow was already there, not flickering this time, not wavering like dust or boxes. Solid, upright, unmoving. It stood with its head slightly tilted as though observing something. As I didn't move for a long moment, I felt a dull, slow thudding behind my ribs, the kind of fear that doesn't rush in but settles like weight. My breath came out in a thin, unsteady stream, and then, almost hesitantly, I turned around again. The room was empty. But the projector light wasn't blocked. Nothing stood between the machine and the wall, yet the shadow remained. I could see the beam passing cleanly through the air, through empty space, and still the silhouette stood there, perfectly formed. As I shut the projector off with a shaky hand, the room plunged into dim yellow from the overhead fluorescence. The shadow vanished. For a moment I felt a small relief until I noticed something that made my heart crawl up toward my throat. The shadow reappeared in the corner of the room, no longer tied to the light. It was faint but visible, darker than the natural dimness, shaped like a person standing at the edge of the filing cabinets. I stepped backward without meaning to, bumping into the projector table. The faint scrape echoed across the room like something moving in response. The shadow didn't shift the way a real person would. Instead, it seemed to grow softer, like it was being absorbed into the wall. As after that night, I told myself I needed sleep, that I'd let my nerves get ahead of me. But the next evening, when I returned to the basement, the room felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. The air was thicker, almost heavy, as though someone had been standing in there just moments before. I turned on the projector again, needing the familiarity of its light, its warmth, its hum. As soon as the beam hit the wall, the shadow appeared again. This time it wasn't just standing, it shifted, leaning forward slightly. The shadow followed me. Not like a person would, not physically, but on the walls. Wherever I moved, its outline repositioned itself, adjusting its angle as though keeping its focus on me. When I stepped left, it re-angled. When I crouched, its head tilted downward. I remember my throat tightening, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I turned the projector off entirely, plunging the room into dim light, but the faint silhouette stayed, not as sharp, not as dark, but undeniably there. I packed up early and left that night, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me far longer than I realized. For the next week, I avoided the archives altogether. I took calls from home, shuffled responsibilities to daytime hours, even asked a coworker to handle the older films for a bit. But one night, when I finally had to return to finish an overdue project, the fear settled back into my chest the moment I stepped inside. The projector wasn't even on. Yet the shadow was already on the far wall, faint but present. I froze at the doorway. As I watched, it slowly lifted its head, shifting in that impossible way only shadows can, responding not to movement but to attention. As I left the job at the end of that week, I haven't been back to that basement since, but I still think about the projector. The way the warm light made the room feel smaller, safer, almost intimate, until the shadows began showing things they shouldn't. And sometimes, in dim lecture halls or in the flicker of passing headlights on a wall, I catch a glimpse of something tall standing just behind the beam of light. A shape waiting for a surface to appear. A shape that never really needed the projector at all. For years, I drove the same rural road every morning before the sun came up. A long, winding stretch that cut through empty fields and patches of forest. I worked the early shift at a distribution center, so I usually hit the road around 5 when the world was still quiet and bluish with leftover night. My route became something familiar and almost comforting. The hum of the engine warming up, the faint smell of cold dew in the air when I stepped outside, the way fog sometimes hung low over the grass like sleep refusing to lift. There wasn't much to look at along the way, but I grew used to the landmarks. The old barn with the collapsed roof, the faded billboard about halfway down the road, and a lonely bus stop that didn't seem to serve anyone but stood there anyway like a forgotten prop. The bus stop was nothing more than a wooden bench under a tin awning on a gravel patch beside the road. I never saw anyone using it, not once in all those years. It didn't even have a route sign anymore. Just a bare frame of weathered wood and a bench that looked too splintered to sit on comfortably. It always struck me as odd, but not in a frightening way. More like a relic, something that remained long after people stopped needing it. That changed one cold morning in late October. The air was sharp enough to make my fingers ache by the time I got my keys out, and a thin frost had settled over the windshield. As I drove past the first curve, the fog thickened until it felt like I was pushing my car through a quiet, pale tunnel. When I reached the bus stop, the fog parted just enough for my headlights to sweep across the bench, and someone was sitting there. I slowed instinctively. The figure was hunched slightly, arms tucked in clothes, their head bowed as though staring at the ground. Even through the fog, I could tell they were dressed oddly, too many layers, shapes under clothing that didn't look quite right. For a split second, I thought it might be a kid waiting for a ride. But who waited for a bus at 5 in the morning on a route that didn't exist anymore? Before I could think too much about it, I drove on, telling myself maybe someone nearby still used that old stop as a meeting point. The moment passed quickly enough, but a faint unease clung to me during the rest of the drive. On the next day, the figure was there again. The same posture, same hunched shape, same bowed head. This time I felt my pulse pick up. Something about the way the figure sat so still, not shifting weight, not reacting to the headlights, looked unnatural. But I didn't slow down. I kept the same speed and tried not to stare, though my eyes leaned toward the mirror without my permission. That was when the first strange thing happened. In the rearview mirror, the figure wasn't sitting on the bench anymore. They were standing, just standing on the gravel beside the road, head still bowed. But when I turned my head instinctively to check, the area behind me was empty. The bench was bare. The gravel looked undisturbed. When I glanced back at the mirror, the figure was seated again. The realization that the mirror and reality didn't match made my breath stutter for a moment. I told myself I was tired, that the fog was distorting depth, that headlights played tricks. Anything. But the feeling lingered long after I arrived at work, a subtle tightness in my chest, like something had stared at me even if I hadn't stared back. By the third morning, I dreaded reaching that part of the road. Fog covered the fields again, swirling in slow, deliberate movements as though following the car. My headlights sliced through the dimness as I approached the bus stop, and the figure was there once more. Only this time they were standing beside the bench. Not hunched, not seated, facing the road. My stomach dropped. The figure was too still, too stiff. I couldn't see their face, their head was angled down just slightly, but the posture made something deep in me tense up. The way their arms hung, the way their shoulders squared toward the road, it looked like they were waiting for me specifically. As I didn't slow down, I forced myself to look straight ahead and pass without reacting. But again, my eyes betrayed me and flicked toward the mirror the moment the stop fell behind. So the figure was walking. Not fast, not lunging. Just walking after my car, one slow step at a time, their form barely visible through the fog as they drifted along the gravel shoulder. But when I turned my head, the road behind me was empty. That was the moment I realized something was deeply wrong. The figure wasn't following me on the road, they were following me only in the reflection, only in the mirror. Something about that made my skin crawl in a way I had never felt before. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything that belonged on that road. The following morning, I almost didn't drive to work. But my job depended on punctuality and calling out wasn't an option. I left early, hoping the extra time would give me courage or clarity or some kind of logical explanation. The fog was worse than usual, thicker, heavier, like a slow-moving curtain. When the bus stop came into view, my heart pressed hard against my ribs. The figure wasn't by the bench. They weren't standing in the road. They were right beside my parked car. Close enough that if I rolled down the window, I could have reached out and touched the air where they stood. Except they weren't really there. Not in the real world. Only in the mirrors. My breath caught sharply as I stared at the reflection, the bowed head, the heavy layers of clothing, the distorted outline of shoulders that didn't slope the way human shoulders should. Every instinct in me screamed to drive. And I did, with foot slamming down much harder than I intended, tires skidding slightly on frost. I didn't look back again. I didn't care what the mirror showed. I just needed distance. So over the next week, I avoided the road entirely, choosing a longer route that added 15 minutes to my commute. It didn't matter. I didn't want to risk seeing that figure again. But avoidance only helped for so long. One evening, when I left work after dark, my car's interior lights flickered for a moment as I unlocked it. When I glanced into the rearview mirror to adjust my seat, I saw something that made my chest tighten so sharply I couldn't breathe for a second. Well, the foggy shape of a figure was sitting on the back seat. A head bowed, hands resting in its lap, completely still. As I spun around so fast, I knocked my shoulder into the door frame. The back seat was empty. My breath fogged the air in short, sharp bursts. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I never used that car again. Even now, long after I sold it, I still refuse to drive early in the morning or anywhere near empty rural bus stops. And sometimes, when I walk past large windows or glass doors at night, I catch a faint reflection of someone sitting quietly just behind me, shoulders hunched, head bowed, waiting. Not in the real world. Just in the reflection. For most of my life, I've been a light sleeper, the kind of person who wakes up when a door clicks shut 2 rooms away or when the air conditioning turns on a second earlier than usual. I always thought it was just the way my body was wired, a leftover instinct from childhood when I used to be scared of the dark. By the time I reached my late 20s, I had learned to live with it. I kept my apartment quiet, my bed positioned away from noisy vents, and my phone on silent. Nights were usually peaceful, if a little lonely, and I often drifted off with only the soft hum of distant traffic to keep me company. The strange feeling started on a Tuesday, a night that wasn't different from any other. I went to bed a little after midnight, tired from work but not exhausted. The air in my room was cool, the sheets freshly washed, and the lamp on my nightstand cast a warm, dim glow across the floor. Nothing out of the ordinary. I remember turning off the light and listening to the subtle tick of the ceiling fan pulling air across the room. The shadows settled into their usual shapes, and I finally let my eyes close. I woke up sometime around 3. Not suddenly, not with that jolt you get when a dream pulls you back into your body, but slowly, as if something had drifted close to the surface of my awareness and tugged me gently awake. My eyes remained closed at first. I was lying on my side, facing the wall, my back warm against my blanket. I wasn't shivering, I wasn't sweating. I was just aware, aware of something in the room that hadn't been there when I fell asleep. A faint pressure tingled along my legs, like the mattress had dipped near the foot of the bed. It wasn't heavy, more like the sensation of someone resting their hands lightly on the edge, pressing down just enough for my body to register the shift. I told myself it was nothing, the mattress settling, or my muscles twitching from a half-remembered dream. I didn't move at first, didn't even open my eyes, hoping the feeling would pass if I ignored it. But then I heard it. A soft exhale, not mine, coming from the base of the bed. The sound was faint, a barely there release of air, like someone breathing through their nose. It was so quiet I thought it might be the radiator, but the rhythm was too natural, too alive. My own breathing slowed, instinctively trying to match it, to understand it. The exhale repeated, steady and patient, almost as if whoever it belonged to wasn't trying to hide or rush. They were just there, settled, waiting. My skin prickled along my spine. I held my breath, unwilling to make a sound, afraid that even the softest inhale might acknowledge whatever shared the room with me. After a few seconds, my heartbeat grew too loud in my ears, each thud pushing against the quiet like it was risking attention. I finally opened my eyes, but only slightly, peeking toward the floor where the moonlight spilled across the carpet. I didn't see anything there, not from that angle. I turned a fraction of an inch, careful not to rustle the sheets. The pressure at the foot of the bed grew more defined, not a weight, a presence. Something crouched low, barely shifting, the air around it feeling different, denser, cooler. I swallowed quietly and forced myself to look toward the end of the mattress. That was when I saw it. Not clearly, not the whole shape, just the outline of something small, something low to the mattress, rising no higher than my knee. It didn't look like an animal. The proportions were wrong, too narrow in the shoulders, too long in the torso. And the head was tilted upward just slightly, as if looking at me, though I couldn't see its face. Only the faint hint of a shadow in the darkness. My breath caught. The pressure increased for a moment, a gentle downward shift as though it leaned in closer. I stayed completely still. I felt trapped inside my own body, my limbs heavy and useless. Every instinct screamed to move, to turn on the light, to run, but the thing didn't move with any hint of aggression. It was just there, quiet, observing. Minutes passed like that, I don't know how many. The only sound in the room was that soft, steady exhale at the foot of the bed. My eyes watered from not blinking enough. My muscles trembled from trying to hold still. Eventually, I mustered the courage to lift my hand just a little, moving slowly, inch by inch, toward the lamp on the nightstand. If I could just reach it, if I could flood the room with light, maybe whatever it was would disappear like a nightmare. My fingers brushed the base of the lamp. The breathing stopped. Not eased, not faded. It stopped instantly, as if someone had closed a door on the sound. I felt a shifting at the foot of the bed, a tiny adjustment in weight that traveled up through the springs and into my legs like a warning. I froze, hand hovering just below the switch. The room seemed to hold its breath with me. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the thing moved off the bed. No footsteps, no dragging, just the sensation of the weight lifting, followed by a faint rustle of fabric as something touched the floor. I didn't dare lift my head to look. My heart pounded so hard it felt painful. For several seconds there was nothing, no breathing, no movement, just silence so thick it seemed to press against my ears. When the sound finally came, it was soft, a shift of carpet fibers, a slow, almost hesitant repositioning of limbs. It was now standing beside me. The air felt colder. My skin tightened. I could feel it just inches from my shoulder, though I couldn't see anything in the dark. A slow exhale brushed against the side of my neck, faint but unmistakable. That was when panic finally overwhelmed me. I turned on the lamp with a sharp click and twisted toward it. Nothing was there. The room was empty. My floor was bare. The air was still. The mattress at the foot of the bed looked perfectly smooth, as if it had never dipped at all. I sat upright, gasping, my chest tight with confusion and leftover fear. The light made everything feel normal, almost disappointingly normal, like something had played a trick on my senses and then slipped away the moment I sought proof. I didn't sleep again that night. Over the next week, the experience repeated, never as intense, never as obvious, but always present. A dip in the mattress, a faint exhale, a shifting shadow in the dark, always at the foot of the bed, always watching. I kept the lamp on for nights afterward, but sometimes I would wake to find the bulb dimmer than it should be, its warm glow barely reaching my blanket. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I moved apartments. I bought a new bed, new sheets, new everything. For a while, it worked. I slept soundly. The nights were peaceful again. But last month, I woke up in the same slow, creeping way, not startled, not fully aware, just enough to sense something had changed. The air felt cooler. My legs felt heavier. And when I listened closely, heart pounding in my throat, I heard it again. A soft exhale, right at the foot of the bed. Still waiting, still watching, still knowing where to find me no matter where I go. There's a long stretch of farmland outside the town where I used to live. Miles and miles of open land broken up by the occasional tree, fence, or abandoned tractor. I drove that route home almost every night after my late shift, and over time it became a part of my routine, as familiar as brushing my teeth. The landscape always looked different depending on the season: golden in the summer, brittle and brown in the fall, and in winter, flat and pale like the world had been drained of color. At night, though, everything blended into a single dark expanse. My headlights would carve a narrow path through it, and beyond that was nothing but empty, silent fields stretching beneath a sky that always felt too big. Driving through that emptiness used to calm me. It made the world feel quiet and manageable, like all the noise and stress from my day stayed behind me once I turned onto that road. The first night I saw the man standing out there, the sky was overcast and the moon was hiding behind thick clouds. The air pressed coolly against the windshield, leaving faint trails of condensation around the edges. I remember shaking off the drowsiness from a long shift and blinking a few times to keep my eyes alert. That was when my headlights skimmed across a figure in the distance, a man standing perfectly still in the middle of a wide, empty field. I almost didn't process it at first. It could have been a scarecrow or a fence post, but something about the shape lingered in my mind long after the moment passed. The posture had been too upright, too defined. I kept driving, telling myself it wasn't anything unusual, but the image tucked itself into the back of my thoughts like a burr catching on fabric. Well, the next night he was there again. This time I saw him more clearly. He stood maybe 200 feet away from the road, facing the direction of my car. My headlights hit him indirectly, but enough to see the outline of a person, straight shoulders, long arms, no noticeable movement. I slowed down just a little, not sure why, maybe out of instinct or caution. The figure didn't react. He didn't raise a hand or turn his head. He just stood there as if he had always been part of the landscape. When I looked again in the mirror, the field was empty. I told myself the angle made him disappear or the darkness swallowed the shape. Still, my chest tightened as I drove home. Well, the third night is when I stopped pretending it was nothing. The man was closer to the road now. Not dangerously close, maybe 100 feet away, but standing in that exact same posture, facing the road, completely still. I noticed with a slow-building discomfort that he always seemed to appear in the perfect gap between the passing trees, as if waiting for the moment the headlights would catch him. The way he stood there felt intentional, expectant even. I watched him for as long as my headlights allowed, waiting for any sign of life, a shift of weight, a tilt of the head. There was none. But the strangest part wasn't what I saw on the road. It was what I saw in the rearview mirror. As soon as the field fell behind me, I glanced up and the man was standing much closer in the reflection. Not by the road, not in the distance, but maybe 20 feet from the edge of the asphalt facing my car. My breath hitched in my throat. I whipped my head around instinctively, but the field behind me was empty in the real world. When I looked back at the mirror again, the shape was gone. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the mirror showing something the real world didn't. It didn't feel like a hallucination or exhaustion. It felt like something trying to be seen only through the places we check without thinking. The next evening, I left work early, telling myself that seeing the road in daylight would ease my fears. The fields looked normal in the afternoon, open, quiet, empty. But when the sun dipped low and shadows clung to the fence lines, a feeling of unease crept up the back of my neck. By the time I reached the familiar stretch of land, the sky had gone dim and the road glowed with the warm orange of my headlights. That was when I saw him again. This time he stood at the edge of the field, close enough that if the road weren't so quiet, I might have stopped to ask if he needed help. Something about his posture kept me from slowing down. He wasn't signaling. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even angled toward me, not entirely. He was facing slightly away, like he'd just stepped forward or was about to take a step deeper into the field. But in the mirror, he was looking at me. Not close, but closer than before. His silhouette filled a little more of the frame. I felt my fingers gripping the wheel harder. The road hummed beneath me. The mirror vibrated slightly from the engine, and the shape in the reflection vibrated too, but the real field behind me remained still. That was the night I realized I shouldn't look back at all. For the rest of the week, I kept my eyes forward when I passed the field. It didn't help. I still felt him out there, watching from the dark. Even without checking the mirror, the presence pressed against my awareness like static in the air. On the seventh night, everything changed. I was already tense as I approached the field, my shoulders tight, breath shallow. The sky was darker than usual, no stars, no moon, just a thick black dome overhead. When my headlights swept across the fields, I didn't see the man. Relief fluttered in my chest, brief, fragile. Then in the mirror, he appeared, standing in the center of the road behind me, facing me, feet directly on the asphalt. My heart slammed hard, painful. I didn't look back, not with my real eyes. I kept staring at the road ahead, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. In the mirror, he seemed closer now. The headlights behind me were off, yet his silhouette was clear, too clear, defined by a light that didn't exist. As I pressed the gas harder, racing home, I didn't blink. I didn't look directly at anything except the road ahead. My mind screamed not to acknowledge him. I felt, in some deep instinctual way, that looking directly might invite something I wasn't prepared for. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the mirror showed only my empty street. I sagged against the steering wheel, shaking with leftover adrenaline. I took a different route to work after that, an extra 15 minutes, all residential roads, no open fields. I thought it solved the problem. I was wrong. A few weeks later, I walked past a store window at dusk, the glass reflecting the street behind me. And in that reflection, far across the road in a narrow patch of land between two houses, I saw a tall, still silhouette. Facing me, as unmoving, awaiting. The cars passing between us showed nothing on the grass, but the reflection held him there, patient as ever. I don't drive near open land anymore. I avoid windows at night. And when I feel eyes on me in places no one should be watching, I don't check the glass. Because the reflection sees things the real world doesn't. And he's always facing me. Night has a way of revealing things we're not meant to notice. When the world grows quiet and the familiar blurs into shadow, even the smallest flicker or shape can take on a life of its own. These stories remind us that sometimes the impossible doesn't arrive with noise or warning, it appears softly, lingering at the edge of vision, patient enough to be seen only by those awake at the wrong moment. The dark has always held more than we understand, and tonight felt like a quiet reminder of that truth. If you felt something stir inside you as these accounts unfolded, you're not alone. We all carry memories we hesitate to revisit, moments when we glimpse something that didn't fit, something we quietly pushed away because acknowledging it felt too heavy. Listening to these stories is a way of sharing that silent burden together, as if we're all sitting in the same dim room, letting the night breathe around us while we admit the things we usually keep to ourselves. As you settle back into the stillness of your own space, let your breath slow and the world return to its softer shape. If you want more nights like this, more quiet, unsettling truths whispered in the dark, you can stay close, subscribe, or visit again whenever sleep feels distant. These stories will be here, waiting in the calm between hours. But for now, rest. Let the strange things fade to the edges of your mind. The night has heard enough for one evening, and whatever watches from the quiet will wait until tomorrow.